When we pay closer attention to the geopolitics, again, today, when we look at the complication of the geopolitics, and there's no surprise today, we continue to see this political polarization around the world. On one hand, people are asking the question, what about the direction for the future, especially for some of the major powers? We'll look at the US, Russia, China. But on the other hand, people continue to question the authenticity of some of the leaders. It's one thing that we look at that's economic and political imbalance, but it's also more concerning about how those powers can actually transform or perhaps even have already transformed the lives of the average citizens. Remember, we're living in the world today that it's not just about what happened right now or what will happen in the future, but also we need to examine what happened in the past. And so that's why in this episode that we're going to specifically to talk about how the past event have already shaped the future of the world. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, Dr. Brendan Sims. Dr. Sims is the founder and the director of the Center for Geopolitics. He works on European geopolitics, past and the present, and his principal interests are the German question, Britain and Europe, and he's the amazing author of this great book called The Return of the Great Powers. Well, Dr. Sims, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely, sir. Such an honor to have you on our program. I want to dive into your book right away because today when we think about the term great power, we normally think about this political domination, or we think about this economic ambition, and this global drive. So Dr. Sims, from your perspective, look at the complication of the geopolitics today and also the political polarization, for example, in the West, and also the war in Ukraine. Put everything together. How would you redefine the term great power, and why do you think today it looks like the term is getting more and more ambiguous? Your thoughts?
Well, going back to the last 20 or 30 years, and particularly the period before, let's say, 2015 or so, when we begin to see the return of great power politics. If we look at that earlier period, you see a time when there was a huge emphasis on the importance of economics, the importance of globalization, the idea that the world was moving closer and closer together. And in consequence of that, many people argued either that we only had one big power, which was the United States, or in fact that we had left behind the very idea of the great powers, which, as you know, Will, had of course shaped our history for hundreds of years, maybe longer before that. And so what I think we're seeing today, to answer your question now more directly, is I think a move away from that much greater emphasis on economics towards geopolitics. So to give you an example, you've got powers like states like Germany or Japan, which are economically very strong, much stronger economically than, say, Russia, which, generously regarded might be the 9th or the 10th biggest economy in the world, probably is actually lower even. And yet Russia is a massive nuclear power, a power which has attacked its neighbors, and is, whether we like it or not, a great power. And it is Russia which has been setting the agenda for much of the last 10 years. So I think what we're seeing is a return of geopolitics, which in many cases is now trumping economics. It's impossible to think of economic connection now without geopolitics, whereas that wasn't really the case 20 or 30 years ago.
Dr. Sims, before we dive into your book a little bit deeper, let's again look at what's happening in the West today. Believe it or not, we are seeing this political polarization, and especially for the Democrats. And they're so concerned about the rise of what they called democratic socialism. I believe that within this Democratic Party, again, Dr. Sims, correct me if I'm wrong, there seemed to be an ongoing, unceasing battle even within the party, because the conventional or the traditional players are saying that this is not political ideology that is going to change the tone of the voice or perhaps the culture of the party. But for a lot of younger generations of the Democratic Party, they're saying this is going to cause, or this is going to be a huge wave, so to speak, for the future of the country. So, Dr. Sims, from your perspective, again, I know even you dive so much deeper into this concept that what you called the peer competition, but I am not talking about that this competition between one country and another, but internally there seemed to be a unsolvable or perhaps even more perplexing competition within a party. How do we understand that? Would you please explain that a bit more?
Well, I'm probably not the best person to interpret American domestic politics. What I can do is talk a little bit about what it means for the American position in the world. And that is, as you've already hinted, is very problematic. The reason being that you now have huge divisions within the United States, over everything, domestic matters, so that weakens the country in the international sphere. It creates a distraction. You have the polarization you referred to. But B, there's also disagreement then about what the greatest threats are. And whereas you could, I think, reasonably say that there was a consensus, say, between 2022 and 2024, that the threats to the West and to the United States in particular came from the rivalry with the People's Republic of China and, of course, Russian revisionism in Europe and elsewhere. Now, post the 7th of October attacks by Hamas on Israel and then the Israeli response, you're seeing a very large constituency within the US which believes that Israel is a bigger threat, for example, than either Russia or the PRC. And you also see the rise on the other side, on the right, if you like. You see a large constituency which doesn't believe that Ukraine is worth defending and does not see Russia as a rival. So this polarization certainly affects the United States' role in the world and its posture as a great power. I would, however, add one caveat, and that is that, of course, internal dissension is also a sign of democratic vibrancy. That is what democracies do. We disagree about the nature of the polity. And so I think we need to be a little bit careful to exaggerate the divisions within Western countries, because what you've described, we can equally see in other parts, for example, of the West, particularly, Germany, other European countries, United Kingdom to a certain extent. So all of that is true. On the other hand, we shouldn't overestimate the cohesion of the autocracies, particularly of Russia, but also the People's Republic of China, where, of course, you don't have a free and open debate, and therefore you don't have visible signs of dissension, and you will only really see these when they've become too obvious to ignore. To give you a simple example of that, you had the Prigozhin revolt in Russia, which nobody had predicted in the summer of 2023. Nobody came out to support Prigozhin, but equally nobody really tried to stop Prigozhin either. I mean, he simply self-deterred. Now, what that tells us is that there is dissent within Russia of whatever nature. I mean, that was elite dissent, if you like, but there are other forms of dissent. But it also shows us that we will only see that dissent when it bubbles over. And so I would add a caution that we shouldn't necessarily assume that our internal divisions are just weaken us, and that as far as the other powers are concerned, that their autocracy strengthens them. In fact, the historical record shows the opposite.
Dr. Sims, let's dive into your book a little bit deeper, especially that you mentioned the word military. Because that today, when we look at this rise of the military power in China, and also this unquenchable hunger of military power in Russia, in your book, you actually talk about the rise of the People's Republic of China. Again, Dr. Sims, I am no historian. I mean, you're the expert. But can you talk a little bit about, based on your research and based on your expertise, looking back what happened in the past, why is this so crucial for us to understand the birth of China and also look at this military power ambition and this military power rise in China throughout the centuries? Can you dive into a little bit more? Thank you.
So I think the first thing to be said is that from an historical perspective, and I think probably also from the perspective of mainland China, it's not just the rise of China, it's the return of China. Of course, China had been its own world for hundreds, thousands of years, indeed. It had its whole Sinocentric system, the idea of all under heaven, and other concepts. And so the West, rather rudely and brutally, indeed, imperially, imposed itself on that world, and indeed on Japan as well, propelling then a modernization and a reaction, which led to the rise of the CCP in mainland China, and then through various stages, which we don't need to elaborate, to this truly phenomenal economic growth of the PRC, which has then led to it being at least the second largest economy in the world. Now, what I would say again is that geopolitics is important, and we shouldn't underestimate just how significant the PRC was even before the economic growth. So if we were to look in the 1950s and 1960s, Mao's China was a massive factor in the world. Big issue in Washington, even though its economy in global dollar terms was tiny, So again, geopolitics is important, economics is not everything. But it is the case that as a result of this economic growth, the PRC now presents as an alternative in the world. It is an alternative to Western power, and it has its own sense. And I'm trying to be fair here because I am, of course, a man of the West. I see things from a Western perspective. And I can very well understand that, of course, not everybody takes that view. And if you're looking at it from let's say, the perspective of Beijing, this is a return of the importance of China. It is a rebalancing of the world. And it is taking advantage, if you like, of temporary, I would regard them as temporary, but nevertheless important difficulties in the West in order to push its agenda in the world. And you see this most significantly, I suppose, with regard to Taiwan, which is in contention, but also with regard to the South China Sea, where, of course, the PRC has been quite active in establishing, vindicating its what it regards as its historical claims to certain islands and resources, and so on. And all of this, as is well known, poses a massive challenge to the existing order, and in particular, of course, to the West.
Dr. Sims, there used to be a saying when we think about China or when it came to China, and some scholars believe that treating China is like similar to say, scratch the head of the crocodile and expect the crocodile to purr. And we know that in reality, that's not going to happen. But since you talk about the history of China, I want to move on our conversation to look at another perspective is how much do you think today that the world, especially the West, truly understands that what is China doing, especially when we look at this political structure? Because we know in the political science world that there are two things. One thing is called the form. The other one is the content. Too often we tend to think about the form should be the priority over the content. But when we look at China, but when we look at this political ambition under Xi Jinping and this military power hunger under the administration, the content seemed to be more important than the form. So, Dr. Sims, from your perspective, do you think that today that the West has been completely misled by the image of China, but not really by the content of China, if that makes sense? Your thoughts?
Well, that's a terrific question, Will. And I should say, before answering it, that of course I'm not an expert on China. And I think, and there are many experts on China whom I've consulted. And of course they differ. And they are also candid about exactly the difficulty you refer to, which is to actually establish what is going on inside that regime. Because many people I respect argue that we're looking at a policy of expansionism. Others whom I also respect argue that this is a regime which is very much focused on domestic issues, keeping the population happy, spends more on domestic surveillance and repression than it does on the military, and so on. And these are all very good arguments. What I think is clear is that the West did make one fundamentally incorrect assumption from, shall we say, the early 1990s onwards. And that was an assumption, and by the way, this was not a case of the PRC deceiving us. I mean, we deceived ourselves. We were within a framework, an intellectual framework, which assumed the natural, inevitable victory of a Western democratic capitalist system. And we had some grounds for believing that because of the outcome of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we thought that by engaging with the PRC economically and politically, that there would be then a kind of a convergence, if you like, but more on our terms than on theirs, and that we would see a gradual political liberalization of the regime. Now, that plainly has not happened. So whatever else we know or didn't know about the PRC, in that respect, we were mistaken. Whether we are now right to warn that conflict is inevitable by 2027, the so-called Davidson window, for example, I'm not so sure, because the remarks of Mr. Xi Jinping can be interpreted in different ways. And I think that is also a frustration that I had as somebody looking at this story, is that the evidence of public statements from the PRC is much less straightforward than the evidence from the Russian Federation. Let me put it that way. Vladimir Putin makes a lot better copy, if you like, than Xi Jinping. I don't know whether you'd agree with that. And so divining intention from those statements is really the hardest thing.
Dr. Sims, I know you're very busy. I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, I know in your book, especially, again, you dive into the historical facts and also the research, but are so many popular terms today when we think about, we just talk about China, we talk about the West and also Russia. The term such as Indo-Pacific versus Asia-Pacific. And also you mentioned about South China Sea and Taiwan. So put everything together, Dr. Sims. Do you think that today, when we look at what's happening regarding the territorial dispute, there has to be, or from the historical perspective, there seemed to be a ideological misrepresentation or misinterpretation of those terms today? So in other words, we can't just look at the terms and believe the definitions and based on our experiences, but also we need to think about the reality that we're living today. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you're quite right to remind us that, of course, naming is never neutral. What we call things or what we call spaces is inherently political. That's absolutely correct. And I do point out in the book that the coinage, the term Indo-Pacific, particularly the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which was adopted by the Americans, is actually a Japanese coinage of Shinzo Abe. And I'm aware that there are many, particularly the PRC, who would prefer the term Asia Pacific or East Asia or something like that. Because, of course, when we call something Indo-Pacific, we are implying that there is some wider space which is connected. Now, I happen to believe that these spaces are connected. So that is why I'm happy to use the term, not least also because it is so widely used and it has coinage. But if you think of, say, the AUKUS submarine deal, a large part of the thinking around that is to do with the idea that there is an Indo-Pacific. And of course, if you look at the Quad concept equally, it is an Indo-Pacific framework which underpins that. So it's not an invention at all. I think it actually does describe a current reality. But you're right to remind us that the term is itself political, as is indeed, of course, Asia Pacific, and almost any other term you care to think of.
Again, Dr. Sims, this is such an amazing book, and I have to say that the more I read so far, and the more questions I have, and I know your time is very, very precious, so I do want to briefly wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, the book is called The Return of the Great Powers. Dr. Sims, not everyone is an expert on geopolitics, and not everyone is mindful about the complication of the military and also this political races. But from your perspective, what are your expectations from the readers by reading your book? Because we know that today, when we think about China, when we think about Russia and the West and so many more, it's not a one-liner. It really demands and requires anyone to read the book back and forth and to understand what happened in the past and what about what's going to happen in the future. So I really want you to tell us, how would you expect the readers to appreciate your work, and especially would look at this uncertainty of the geopolitics today? Your final thoughts.
Well, what I would like the reader to take away, in particular, if you ask me to single out one thing, it would be the importance of history, the way in which history is not merely the background, what you need to know to understand the problem, but that the history is a living thing. It is, in some cases, a driver, and in some cases, a constraint. So if you think of the PRC, it's definitely a driver. There is a sense of a century of humiliation inflicted by the Western imperialist powers in the 19th century through to the mid-20th century, and then a China which has arisen, which has stood up, and now this is being vindicated by Xi Jinping. So the history is living in him. I mean, he refers to it all the time. It is part of the official discourse. If you take, say, the Russian Federation, the idea that Russia has always been a great power, that in fact Russia has to be a great power, that Russianness is tied up with great powerness, it's even in the language almost. That you can see is something that obsesses Vladimir Putin. You see that to a lesser extent with some other powers. You see that the French concept of grandeur. You see it, of course, in the United Kingdom. It's also part of the US view. But then you've got other contenders like Germany and Japan, where the history is more of a constraint because of the way in which Japan and Germany behaved, the terrible way in which they behaved in the Second World War, and that legacy which continues on. If you think of the comfort women, if you think of all the arguments, particularly between the PRC and South Korea and Japan, that's a history which also continues. So I'd like the reader to come away with a sense of that history as something as a living, breathing phenomenon, which is actually powering this whole story and is still with us today.
Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, such an honor to speak to Dr. Brendan Sims. Dr. Sims is the founder and the director of the Center for Geopolitics. He works on European geopolitics, the past and the present, and his principal interests are the German question, Britain and Europe, and so many more. And I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out this amazing book, which is called The Return of the Great Powers. Well, Dr. Sims, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. And again, we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to explore the complication of the geopolitics today. So thank you so much for doing this.